Hi everyone, my name is Chaganti and I'm a professor of English at the University of California, Davis. Today I'm going to speak about the late medieval visual and poetic tradition known as Danse Macabre. On the webpage below, you'll find links to allow you to explore with your students both some visual and some poetic archives related to Danse Macabre. In addition to this, I recently published a book that talks about Danse Macabre in some detail, and below as well, you'll find a link to a free PDF of a chapter from that book, which my publisher, the University of Chicago Press, has provided so that you can have access to that resource as well for further background if you'd like to teach this material. While Danse Macabre is not necessarily a direct response to medieval plague, it provides us with an interesting window onto a culture that was thinking a lot about death and dying. And for that reason, I'm going to suggest today, Danse Macabre can facilitate some important discussions about how we are responding to our current situation. So what I'm providing here is not only informational context, but also ideas for discussion and study. These can be used synchronously or asynchronously. I'm going to embed some possible questions for students into my presentation. I will offer some thoughts about these questions in case that's helpful, but I've also designed these questions to be fairly open so that you and your students can go in completely other directions with them. I'm going to issue a brief content warning before proceeding. It's my understanding that educators have been requesting content relating to plague and pandemic, and I'm providing that. But it's important to preface this, I think, by saying I'm going to be showing some imagery and ideas that confront death fairly graphically, which may be difficult for you or students depending on how COVID-19 is affecting your lives right now. So let's talk about Danse Macabre as a phrase and a cultural phenomenon first to situate ourselves in the material I'm showing you. Most of you are probably already familiar with the expression Danse Macabre and also with the way we understand it in English, a dance of death. The word macabre itself is of undetermined etymology, but versions of it appear in medieval records associating it with a visual tradition we might also be familiar with, skeletons dancing in some sense, perhaps in a group or in a procession. I should clarify at the outset that it's very hard to determine from the evidence that we have remaining the extent to which Danse Macabre was simply a tradition of visual art versus the extent to which it was an actual performance tradition. There's some sort of indirect evidence that might suggest Danse Macabre as a performance idiom, perhaps embedded within plays or incorporated in some way into a large public sermon, but these are somewhat speculative and difficult to really do a whole lot with. I talk about this a little bit more in the book chapter. So I'm going to be focusing today specifically on Danse Macabre as a tradition of visual art, which has some relationships, obviously, to performance, which I will get into. So to come back to what our own associations with Danse Macabre are, our knowledge of this word macabre, and what we think of when we hear that phrase Danse Macabre, we have these associations, I think, these kinds of dancing skeletons from a number of modern and iconic cultural examples, and perhaps the most famous is Walt Disney's skeleton dance from 1929 in his Silly Symphony series. And here's another image from that cartoon that shows this kind of, more processional kind of configuration. And here is a 1980s cartoon set to a musical composition inspired by the idiom of Danse Macabre by the 19th century composer Camille Saint-Saëns. And you can see in another image from this cartoon that same kind of line or procession that we have just been talking about a little bit. I would say that musically also, the Saint-Saëns depends a lot on a kind of aesthetic of oppressive seriality. And that might be something to discuss with students as well, particularly with students who have performance or music or performance studies backgrounds. And we might expand that into an even larger question. Once you have looked through all this material, students might enjoy thinking about how these modern interpretations of Danse Macabre respond to the medieval tradition beyond simply just replicating those skeleton images. For example, what kind of tone or theme or concepts get drawn out through Saint-Saëns' music that we see resonant in some way with Danse Macabre. So let's ask ourselves now what the longer history is of this cultural idiom and why we might want to talk about it. Imagining figures representing death to dance is a phenomenon with a specifically medieval origin. The first reference appears to occur in the late 14th century, 1376, Je fis de Macabre la danse, There is, so I did the Danse of Macabre. The English poet John Lydgate, whom I'll talk more about in a bit, refers to the Macabre's dance in 1426 around. We also find a reference in a Latin record to a Chorea Macabeorum around 1453 possibly, and that's unclear whether that is a reference to a painting or a performance. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that later. In 1485, the writer Gilbert de Metz produces this very interesting sort of diary of walking around Paris. And in doing so, he describes what he encounters as these peintures notables de la danse macabre, these notable paintings of the danse macabre. So that should bring us to our next question, which is what did these paintings look like? And we will probably not be surprised because we've already seen some of those modern versions and are familiar with them. So to begin answering that question, what do these notable paintings look like? I'm actually going to start with a painting on canvas from a church in Estonia. This is a fragment that was originally much longer, and you can see it begins with this image of a preacher in a pulpit, which might tell us something about the way that some of the themes and ideas of Danse Macabre found their way into sermons and the language of sermons as well. Gilbert, but I think we want to recognize that when Gilbert says peinture notable, he's referring not necessarily to a canvas painting like this, but to a large exterior public wall painting that he saw in Paris. And what these kinds of wall paintings were sometimes frescoes, they were sometimes wooden boards hung in public structures such as cloisters. The one that Gilbert specifically is describing was destroyed after the medieval period. There are some surviving examples throughout Europe, in Berlin, in Brittany, in Inku, Finland, and elsewhere. Many of them are very fragmentary and damaged though. So in order to talk about this further, I'm going to show you not an image from one of those wall paintings, but rather from a book, because it is very well preserved, but also is thought to reflect in its visual program the kinds of things that people might have seen in those public wall paintings. So this is a late 15th century book image, and some details to notice here. We see again the processional structure of the dance, but we also notice the incorporation of architectural elements, these delicate columns and arches that are framing the different participants in the Danse Macabre. We might note that this was actually probably a more common way to see Danse Macabre depictions and paintings with these kinds of architectural elements incorporated into them. So that makes this different from the one from Estonia, which is outdoors and a little bit more unusual in that capacity. That leads us to another question that might be interesting for students, which is to think about what are the different impacts of presenting a Danse Macabre in an outdoor setting as opposed to framed by architecture or other kinds of structural elements. And for students who work in modern film or media studies, they might be interested to think about this other very iconic modern example from the end of the Seventh Seal, this Danse Macabre that is clearly an outdoor one. So that's another provocation that might be helpful. But the depiction of the medieval depiction of Danse Macabre that I find most interesting is this altarpiece. From the mid-15th century, because it shows us what a Danse Macabre mural would have looked like in its original site. This is a mural, this is a painting, an altarpiece painting, most likely by the artist Simon Marmion, depicting a cloister, possibly in Amiens. This piece forms one sort of archival center of what I'm presenting to you today because it's so interesting, and it's also in the public domain as a high resolution file, so it will be easy for instructors to share it with students and notice and discuss its details together. So you can see in a blown up detail of this image, not only the skeletons and living people processing in a configuration that's similar to what we saw before, but also some other interesting features, the architecture that we mentioned, and in addition to that, what look to be poetic inscriptions that are tied in some way to the visual images of the mural, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. But for now, what I want to point out is what is so useful about this image is that it allows us to see how spectators interacted with a Danse Macabre mural. You can see people who might be progressing along the wall looking at it, while others contemplate it from a more static position. And some scholars have observed that if you were to read the poetry while looking at the pictures, you would have to move left to right, which is the opposite direction in which the painted figures seem to be oriented. So we can see that the mural encourages a kind of choreography that involves both the static painting and the moving people. The contrast in direction might even provide a sense of movement to the painted images, where as we become attuned to the movement of actual people, it draws a kind of sense of movement and momentum out of the figures who are going the other way. And of course, the architecture complicates that momentum, it interrupts it sends it around corners. These are all visual details that might be a great way to get students thinking. Again, another specific question about that might concern the painting's interstices, its interstitial spaces, its spaces in between. There are spaces between the painting and the architecture, between the people and the painting, and of course, between the figures who are within the painting, both the skeletons and the people, and as well the spaces that exist between each of those sorts of categories of people. And so I think that, you know, all of that use of interstitial space draws our attention to the in-between space of the Danse Macabre itself. And part of the reason that I'm interested in this idea of interstitial space in the Danse Macabre is that I think it helps us to understand why the idiom of dance in particular is important to Danse Macabre. If you read the work of modern theorists of dance, they will often talk about the way that when you look at a dancing body or a moving body, you aren't just processing visually the body itself. You're also aware of other kinds of space and force that are happening around the body in time and as well as in space, things that are happening sort of anticipatory and you know, ahead of the movement that's going to happen, traces of movement that just happened, the sort of animated space between dancers or between the different parts of the dancer's body. These are all part of the experience of watching dance. And so I think it is interesting and helpful to think about how that perceptual experience of dance might help to explain what Danse Macabre is trying to work out for itself, because of course the notion of a dance that is moving towards death is going to be very preoccupied with that notion of in-between space, space between life and death, the notion of sort of potentiality, anticipation moving towards the future, and the trace of memory left behind. So these are all things that students might also be interested in talking about. Now that we have a sense of this visual tradition and its artistic context, I want to turn in the second part of this presentation to Danse Macabre's relationship to plague. And the first thing that I want to say here is that I want to resist a kind of narrative of straightforward causality. In other words, I think it would be neither helpful nor accurate simply to say that people made Danse Macabre art in direct response to the plague. Some scholars indeed have pointed out that by the 15th century, the plague itself may have metamorphosed into something less lethal than it had been 100 years earlier, when 14th century authors like Boccaccio were writing about fleeing contagion. So I don't think we want necessarily to give students the idea that what is mostly a kind of second half of the 15th century phenomenon is some sort of entirely direct and explicit response to the plague. Many of our associations with plague itself are slightly earlier. At the same time, though, it's hard for us not to note that Danse Macabre seems to represent some sort of working out of ideas, emotions, and philosophies surrounding death. And so we might wonder instead about what it's doing in that capacity. To what extent is Danse Macabre showing us a continued development of thinking about death in the late Middle Ages that may have been inflected by certain kinds of emergency situations, whether those are illness or perhaps war, as in the case of the 100 Years' War, or whether what we are seeing is a kind of response to a residual historical kind of trauma in awareness of these moments when death seems to be surrounding us. So in the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to suggest if we can think about Danse Macabre a bit more expansively that way, as a kind of working out of thoughts about death and its ubiquitous presence. And, you know, clearly the notion of ubiquity is important to Danse Macabre and this alternation between the living and the dead. The dead are actually kind of all around you, or, you know, in every one of your sight lines in a sense. So if we can think about Danse Macabre that way, it might help us to make some sense of how this pandemic is affecting us and operating in our own time. And also, sort of conversely, we might think about how this current pandemic might give us an insight into earlier historical moments of hyper-awareness of death, so that we are, in a sense, speaking back to the Middle Ages as much as they are speaking forward to us. So the first point to make about that brings us back to those poetic inscriptions that I pointed out along the cloister wall. Those were generally stanzas of dialogue between the person in the procession being led toward death and the skeleton leading that person. So I'm going to show us a couple of examples here. These are from a 15th century poem by John Lydgate, whom I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this presentation. I've copied a few stanzas to look at, and these stanzas are copied from a brand new edition of Dance of Death poetry, John Lydgate's, as well as that of other English authors, that was edited by Megan Cook and Elisabetta Strawcob, and that is also linked to as a great resource. It is an entirely online edition of the Dance of Death poetic tradition that is free and accessible and annotated and glossed in some ways. It will be really helpful to students if you're working on Middle English with them. So here are two stanzas. One is death speaking to the king, one is the king answering, and the theme in these stanzas often seems to be that death is a kind of leveler, an equalizer. It comes to everyone. So in the last two lines of the first stanza, who abounds the most in great riches shall bear with him but a single sheet, only a single sheet, so you can have as much as you have, but at death you will just be in your winding sheet and with nothing else. And looking down towards the second stanza, the fourth line from the bottom, death foredoes everything. It's a great Old English word, foredo. That is his usage, that is his habit, that's what he's used to. And so you can see the king here emphasizing great and small, everyone, everyone meets death no matter who they are. So I want to move now to another pair of stanzas in which the laborer and death speak to each other. And so an important feature of this Danse Macabre poetry is that it reflects a tradition of what was known as estates literature, or sometimes estates satire, that displayed this preoccupation with different kinds of social categories in late medieval life, and would kind of enumerate, different kinds of social positions you could hold. So the Danse Macabre poetry tends to begin with people in very elevated positions, kings and emperors and popes and things like that, and move towards people who are in conditions that might make them more vulnerable, who are poorer, and who just lived their lives in a very different kind of way than the kings and emperors at the beginning. And you can see that in Death to the Laborer here, where there is still this continued theme that everybody has to die, but the laborer's answer to death is quite striking, that, that his life has been very hard, such that there have been times when he has even wished after death, and he uses a lot of the language of labor, the spade and the pickaxe, laboring, delving, ditching, the cart, and has been talking about and talks about how there has been no rest for him even in life. And so I think it's very important to notice this feature of Danse Macabre, because I think it speaks to something very directly that we are discovering now in our own conversations about COVID-19. We see a similar discourse around COVID-19 that is conflicting and sometimes even potentially confusing. That on the one hand, the virus doesn't discriminate, right? People really like to say that it affects everyone. But on the other hand, we're aware at the same time that while the virus may not biologically discriminate, it's occurring in societies that are implicitly and explicitly discriminatory, that are built on inequities that mean that we in fact do see the virus affect different groups of people in very different ways, despite its supposed blindness to difference. So what I think is compelling about Danse Macabre here is that it actually seems to have kind of taken on and worked that idea out. It uses its combination of text, art, architecture, the movement that happens within it, when you as a spectator are kind of progressing along, being asked to confront all these different kinds of social realities for different people. I think in all of those ways, it is getting its audience to think about how death both is and is not an equalizer. And so I think it might be really helpful to get students to think about how to use the imagery and the features of Danse Macabre to help them kind of work out and understand some of those ideas as they are being presented to us in our own time and in our own context. I think there are other ways we can relate Danse Macabre to our current moment as well. Something else that I found myself noticing very differently in Danse Macabre art since COVID-19 began is the work of repetitiveness. Now, obviously, these are not pictures of people kind of experiencing, you know, social distancing or stay-at-home orders that we are subject to now. And, you know, our subjection to those things, for those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to kind of stay at home and do what we need to do, means that we do experience time and our lives as repetitive, as days sort of bleeding into each other in these weird ways that we didn't before. Obviously, that is not the medieval context at all. But at the same time, I wonder if the visual and poetic aspects of Danse Macabre might give students some new languages for talking and thinking about experiences of repetitiveness, where the only structure is this structure of underlying anxiety or dread, rather than the usual things that we are accustomed to having structure us in our lives. And that question might also be kind of a neat way of getting how to talk about the role of physical structure in the paintings also. What are those actually kind of holding together or holding in for us? I think these are also questions related to time and how we experience time in a moment of heightened consciousness of death. I think Danse Macabre is very preoccupied with that, and that's something else I talk about more in that chapter that you have a link to. I think there are a bunch of other really interesting themes that could be drawn out here as well. The relationship between death as a kind of particular instance versus death as a universal sort of presence or embodiment. You know, scholars ask that question about the skeletons in Danse Macabre. Are they individual instances connected to their person, or are they kind of one instance moving through time in a sense, you know, and embody or represent death in some larger way? I think we've been having a lot of interesting and difficult conversations about how we think about, you know, death embodied. Who is death? Who gets associated with this pandemic? And so I think those might be another, you know, useful set of avenues to travel down with students. So as you can see, I think there are many ways to not only teach students about this important aspect of medieval death, but also to use this knowledge to help them respond creatively and thoughtfully to their current situations. I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much.